If you love stories of forbidden love, family secrets, and the power of a child's pure heart, make sure to hit that like button and stay with us until the very end. Today's tale will touch your soul in ways you never expected. The year was 1847, and the English countryside lay shrouded in morning mist as Miss Clara Whitmore stepped down from the cramped mail coach. Her travelling dress, though well mended, bore the telltale signs of a woman who had known better days. At 24, she possessed the kind of quiet beauty that revealed itself slowly, intelligent green eyes that held depths of unspoken stories, auburn hair that caught fire in sunlight, and hands that spoke of both gentleness and determination. Ravenshollow Manor loomed before her like something from a Gothic novel, its dark stone towers piercing the grey sky. The estate sprawled across rolling hills, magnificent, yet somehow melancholy, as if the very walls held secrets too heavy to bear. Clara clutched her worn leather satchel closer, reminding herself why she had travelled so far from everything familiar. The advertisement in the Times had been brief, but intriguing. Governess sought for special child, patience and dedication essential. Experience with difficult cases preferred. Generous compensation. Apply Lord Blackthorne, Ravenshollow Manor, Yorkshire. What the advertisement hadn't mentioned was that the special child was the son of one of England's most notorious lords, a man whose very name sent whispers through London's drawing rooms. As Clara approached the massive oak doors, they swung open before she could knock. A stern-faced woman in black bombazine emerged, her greying hair pulled back severely and her mouth set in a permanent line of disapproval. "Miss Whitmore, I presume?" The woman's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to running a household with military precision. "I am Mrs. Henley, the housekeeper. His lordship is expecting you." Clara followed Mrs. Henley through corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to track her movement. The manor's interior was as imposing as its exterior, all dark wood paneling, heavy tapestries, and shadows that seemed to move in her peripheral vision. "A word of advice, miss," Mrs. Henley said, as they walked, her voice echoing in the vast hallway. "Lord Blackthorne values discretion above all else. What happens within these walls stays within these walls. Is that understood?" "Of course," Clara replied, though a chill ran down her spine at the woman's ominous tone. They paused before a door of polished mahogany. Mrs. Henley knocked twice, waited for a gruff enter, then ushered Clara inside what was clearly the master's study. Lord Adrian Blackthorne stood with his back to them, silhouetted against tall windows that overlooked the manor's grounds. Even from behind, he cut an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that touched his collar. When he turned, Clara's breath caught in her throat. He was perhaps 35, with the kind of masculine beauty that poets wrote about and women whispered of in secret. His features were sharp and aristocratic, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw, but it was his eyes that held her captive, dark as midnight and filled with a pain so profound it seemed to emanate from his very soul. A jagged scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, evidence of some long-ago violence that had marked him both physically and, Clara suspected, emotionally. Rather than diminishing his appeal, it only added to his dangerous allure. "Miss Whitmore." His voice was deep, cultured, and edged with weariness. "Please sit." Clara settled into the chair across from his desk, acutely aware of his scrutiny. Lord Blackthorne moved to his own chair with the fluid grace of a predator, his dark eyes never leaving her face. "Your references speak highly of your abilities," he began, though his tone suggested he found little comfort in this fact. "You've worked with difficult children before." "Yes, my lord. I find that children others label difficult are simply misunderstood. They often need patience and a different approach to reach them. Something flickered in his dark eyes, hope perhaps, or maybe just skepticism well disguised. And what of children who cannot speak? Clara's heart constricted at the pain evident in his voice. There are many ways to communicate beyond words, my lord. Often, such children are quite brilliant, but simply need someone willing to listen with more than their ears. Lord Blackthorne was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. Finally he spoke again. My son Thomas is 8 years old. He has never spoken a word. The physicians, his jaw tightened. The physicians have examined him thoroughly. Physically, there is nothing wrong with his voice. They believe the cause is emotional. Clara leaned forward slightly, her professional instincts engaging. What happened to his mother, if I may ask? The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Lord Blackthorne's face became a mask of stone, his eyes going cold as winter frost. That, he said with deadly quiet, is not a topic for discussion, ever. The finality in his voice made Clara's pulse quicken with nervousness, but she pressed on gently. I understand, my lord, but if I'm to help Thomas, I need to understand what might have caused his condition. What you need to understand, Miss Whitmore, is that my son requires education, nothing more. Can you teach a child who cannot or will not speak to read and write? Can you do so without prying into matters that don't concern you? Clara met his fierce gaze steadily. Yes, my lord, I can and I will. For another long moment, they regarded each other in silence. Then Lord Blackthorne nodded curtly. Very well, Mrs. Henley will show you to your quarters. You'll begin with Thomas tomorrow morning. Your salary will be £40 per year, plus room and board. There is one final condition. Clara waited, sensing this was the most important part. Under no circumstances are you to discuss Thomas's condition with anyone outside this household. No letters to friends, no gossip with servants, no casual mentions to tradespeople in the village. His privacy is paramount. Break this confidence and you will be dismissed immediately without references. Is this acceptable? Yes, my lord. He nodded once more, then returned his attention to the papers on his desk. Mrs. Henley will brief you on the household routines. You may go. Clearly dismissed, Clara rose and curtsied. As she reached the door, his voice stopped her. Miss Whitmore. She turned back to find him watching her with an unreadable expression. Thomas is fragile. Whatever happened to make him this way, he didn't deserve it. Perhaps you can succeed where others have failed. The vulnerability in his voice, so at odds with his commanding presence, made Clara's heart ache. I'll do everything in my power to help him, my lord. That evening, as Clara settled into her modest but comfortable quarters in the Manor's west wing, Mrs. Henley brought her tea and what amounted to a briefing on the household. Lord Blackthorne keeps to himself mostly, the housekeeper explained, her stern expression softening slightly in the privacy of Clara's room. He wasn't always so withdrawn. Before, she paused, choosing her words carefully. Before the tragedy he was different. Warmer, but that's neither here nor there now. What tragedy? Clara asked gently. Mrs. Henley's mouth pursed. Not my place to say, miss. What you need to know is that Master Thomas is a sweet child, but he's been through more than any little one should bear. He spends most of his time in the nursery or wandering the Manor's grounds. Rarely causes trouble, but well, you'll see tomorrow. After Mrs. Henley left, Clara stood at her window, gazing out at the moonlit grounds. Somewhere in this vast manor was a little boy trapped in silence, and a man imprisoned by his own demons. Whatever had happened in this family, it had left scars on all who remained. And if you're wondering how a simple governess could possibly help heal such deep wounds, stay with us, because sometimes the most broken hearts need the gentlest touch to begin healing again. The next morning dawned grey and misty, matching Clara's nervous anticipation. She dressed carefully in her most professional attire, a dark blue wool dress with a crisp white collar, and made her way to the nursery as directed. The nursery occupied the entire suite of rooms on the manor's second floor, with tall windows that would have flooded the space with light on a sunnier day. The main room was filled with expensive toys that looked barely touched, beautiful books with pristine spines, and educational materials any child would envy. Yet the space felt lonely, as if it were a museum display rather than a child's living quarters. Thomas sat in a window seat, staring out at the grounds with the kind of stillness that spoke of long practice. Clara's heart immediately went out to him. He was small for 8, with his father's dark hair and what she suspected would be his father's strong features once he fully grew into them. But where Lord Blackthorn's eyes held pain and weariness, Thomas's held something far worse, a resignation that no child should possess. "Good morning, Thomas," Clara said softly, not wanting to startle him. "I'm Miss Whitmore. I'm here to be your teacher." The boy turned to look at her, and Clara was struck by the intelligence in his dark eyes. This was no simple child, whatever his challenges might be. He studied her with the same intensity she'd seen in his father, but where Lord Blackthorn's gaze held suspicion, Thomas's held curiosity. Clara approached slowly, as she might a frightened animal. "May I sit with you?" Thomas considered her question, then nodded once, a tiny gesture, but communication nonetheless. Clara settled beside him on the window seat, careful to leave space between them. "It's quite beautiful from up here," she said, looking out at the grounds. "Do you enjoy watching the grounds from this window?" Another nod. "I imagine you see many interesting things. Birds, perhaps? Rabbits?" Thomas's eyes brightened slightly, and he pointed toward a grove of trees in the distance. Do you see animals there often?" A more enthusiastic nod. This time, Clara smiled. "Perhaps sometime you could show me your favorite spots to watch for them. Would you like that?" For the first time, Thomas's solemn expression softened into something that might have been the ghost of a smile. They spent the rest of that first morning simply getting acquainted. Clara didn't push for speech or even attempt formal lessons. Instead, she followed Thomas's lead, observing what captured his interest and how he preferred to communicate. She quickly realized that Thomas was far from the helpless child others might assume. He had developed an elaborate system of gestures and expressions that served him well. When he wanted something, he found ways to make his needs known. When something pleased him, his entire demeanor brightened. When something distressed him, he would retreat into himself, becoming almost invisible. Most telling of all, Clara noticed how Thomas's eyes constantly tracked toward the windows and doors, as if he were always anticipating someone's arrival or departure. "He's waiting for someone," Clara murmured to herself as she watched him during their lunch together in the nursery. Now, those of you who have children might recognize this behavior. Sometimes, when we've experienced loss, we develop habits of watching and waiting, hoping against hope that the person we've lost might somehow return. For Thomas, this waiting had become a way of life. That afternoon, Clara decided to introduce some gentle structure to their time together. She brought out a slate and chalk, thinking they might begin with simple drawing exercises. "Would you like to show me something you enjoy drawing?" she asked, offering him the chalk. Thomas hesitated, then took the chalk with small, careful fingers. What he drew took Clara's breath away. It was a woman, clearly rendered, despite Thomas's young hand, with long flowing hair and a kind face. She wore what appeared to be a beautiful gown, and in the drawing she was reaching out as if to embrace someone. "Is this someone special to you?" Clara asked gently. Thomas nodded, then pointed to himself. "Your mother?" The slate fell from Thomas's hands and clattered to the floor. The boy's face went white, and he scrambled backward, his eyes wide with what looked like terror. "Oh, Thomas, I'm so sorry," Clara said immediately, moving toward him with her hands extended in a calming gesture. "I didn't mean to upset you." But Thomas had already fled to the far corner of the room, where he curled into a small ball, his shoulders shaking. Clara's heart broke at the sight. Whatever had happened to Thomas's mother, the very mention of her still caused him tremendous distress. She made a mental note to approach the subject with far more care in the future, if at all. "Thomas," she said softly, sitting on the floor several feet away from him, "you're safe. I won't ask about the drawing again if it makes you sad. We can talk about anything else you'd like." Slowly, Thomas raised his head to look at her. His dark eyes were bright with unshed tears, and Clara had to fight the urge to gather him into her arms. "Would you like me to tell you a story instead?" she offered. Thomas nodded, though he remained curled in his protective ball. Clara began weaving a tale about a brave young knight who went on adventures with his faithful horse. As she spoke, she watched Thomas gradually relax, his breathing becoming less rapid, his posture less defensive. By the time she finished her story, Thomas had crept closer, drawn in despite his earlier distress. "Did you like that story?" Clara asked. A small nod. "Tomorrow, perhaps you could help me tell one. Would you like that?" A slightly bigger nod. And this time, Clara was rewarded with that ghostly smile again. As the afternoon wore on, Clara began to understand the depth of Thomas's intelligence. Though he couldn't or wouldn't speak, he absorbed everything around him with remarkable focus. When she showed him books, his eyes followed the words with clear comprehension. When she presented simple mathematics problems using blocks, he solved them quickly and accurately. This child wasn't lacking in ability. He was trapped by something far more complex than a simple learning difficulty. As evening approached and Clara prepared to leave Thomas for the day, she knelt beside his chair. "I enjoyed spending time with you today, Thomas. I hope you did too." The boy reached out hesitantly, then touched Clara's hand for just a moment before pulling back. It was the first physical contact he'd initiated, and Clara felt a surge of hope. "I'll see you tomorrow morning," she promised, "and I'll have a new story for you." As Clara made her way back to her quarters, she encountered Lord Blackthorne in the corridor. He had clearly been waiting for her, though he tried to make it appear casual. "Miss Whitmore, how was your first day with Thomas?" "Challenging but encouraging, my lord. Thomas is extremely intelligent and observant. He communicates quite effectively through gestures and expressions." Something in Lord Blackthorne's posture relaxed slightly, and his cooperation. He was wary at first, which is natural, but by afternoon he seemed more comfortable with my presence. "I believe we can work well together." Lord Blackthorne nodded, though Clara noticed he didn't quite meet her eyes. "Very good. If you need anything, supplies, books, whatever you require for his education, simply inform Mrs. Henley." "Thank you, my lord. I do have one question, if I may." His jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Yes?" "Thomas seems to have knowledge beyond what I might expect for a child who hasn't had formal education. Has he been taught previously?" "His mother," Lord Blackthorne began, then stopped abruptly. When he continued, his voice was carefully controlled. "Yes, he was taught to read by his mother." Before. The pain in those two words was so intense that Clara felt it like a physical blow. "I see. That explains his advanced comprehension. It will make my job easier." Lord Blackthorn nodded curtly, then turned to go. But Clara's voice stopped him. "My lord, may I speak freely?" He turned back, his expression guarded. "What is it?" "Thomas is a remarkable child. Whatever challenges he faces, they don't diminish his worth or his potential. I hope you know that." For a moment, Lord Blackthorn's careful mask slipped, and Clara saw raw vulnerability in his dark eyes. "I fear I've failed him in every way that matters," he said quietly. "Perhaps you can do better." Before Clara could respond, he strode away, leaving her standing alone in the shadowed corridor. Now, if you're thinking this sounds like a man carrying the weight of impossible guilt, you're absolutely right. Sometimes the people we love most are the ones we believe we've hurt the worst. Stay with us, because Lord Blackthorn's story is just beginning to unfold. Over the following weeks, Clara established a routine with Thomas that seemed to benefit them both. Their mornings were spent on traditional lessons, reading, writing, arithmetic, and geography, all adapted to Thomas's unique communication style. The boy proved to be a remarkably quick learner, absorbing information with an hunger that suggested he'd been starved for intellectual stimulation. Their afternoons were devoted to what Clara privately thought of as healing time. They would walk the manor's extensive grounds, with Thomas showing her his favorite hiding spots and secret places. Clara began to understand that Thomas knew every inch of Ravenshollow's property, from the formal gardens to the wild meadows beyond. More importantly, she began to see glimpses of the child Thomas might have been before whatever tragedy had stolen his voice. During their walks, his step was lighter, his expressions more animated. He would point out birds' nests, interesting insects, or unusual flowers with the enthusiasm any 8-year-old might show. It was during one of these afternoon walks that Clara first encountered Lord Blackthorn away from the formal confines of his study. She and Thomas were exploring a walled garden behind the manor when Clara heard the sound of steel ringing against steel. Following the sound, they came upon a courtyard where Lord Blackthorn was engaged in what appeared to be sword practice with an invisible opponent. Clara's breath caught at the sight. Gone were the formal clothes and rigid posture she associated with the lord of the manor. Instead, Lord Blackthorn wore simple dark breeches and a white shirt open at the throat. His dark hair damp with perspiration, he moved with deadly grace, his blade cutting through the air in complex patterns that spoke of years of training. But there was something desperate in his movements, as if he were fighting demons only he could see. Thomas tugged on Clara's skirt and pointed toward his father. When Clara looked down, she saw longing in the boy's eyes, the desperate wish of a child who wanted his father's attention but didn't know how to ask for it. "Would you like to watch for a moment?" Clara whispered. Thomas nodded eagerly. They settled on a stone bench, partially hidden by climbing roses, where they could observe without intruding. Clara found herself mesmerized by Lord Blackthorn's fluid movement, by the play of muscles beneath his thin shirt, by the intense concentration on his scarred face. What kind of man spent his afternoons practicing swordplay with such deadly seriousness? What battles was he preparing for? Or what memories was he trying to exhaust through physical exertion? As if sensing their presence, Lord Blackthorn suddenly stopped mid-movement and turned toward their hiding spot. His dark eyes found Clara's immediately, and the intensity of his gaze made her feel as if she'd been caught doing something improper. "Thomas," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Miss Whitmore." Thomas immediately stood and offered a small bow to his father, a formal gesture that broke Clara's heart with its practiced precision. "We didn't mean to intrude, my lord," Clara said, rising as well. "We were exploring the gardens and heard—" "It's quite all right." Lord Blackthorn set aside his sword and reached for a towel to wipe his face. "These are your grounds as much as mine while you're here. An awkward silence fell over the three of them. Clara could feel the tension radiating from both father and son, a mutual longing complicated by pain and misunderstanding. "Your sword work is quite impressive," Clara ventured, hoping to bridge the gap between them. Lord Blackthorn's mouth quirked in what might have been a bitter smile. "A useless skill in today's world, I'm afraid. But old habits die hard." Thomas stepped forward hesitantly, then pointed at the sword with obvious curiosity. Lord Blackthorn followed his son's gaze, and something flickered across his features, hope perhaps, or maybe just surprise that Thomas had shown interest in anything connected to him. "Would you like to see it?" he asked carefully. Thomas nodded eagerly. Lord Blackthorn picked up the sword, holding it carefully so the blade pointed away from Thomas and Clara. "This belonged to your grandfather, and his grandfather before him. It's been in our family for over 200 years. Thomas's eyes were wide with fascination as he studied the intricate patterns etched into the blade and the jeweled hilt. "Perhaps someday, when you're older, I could teach you proper swordplay," Lord Blackthorn said quietly. "If you'd like to learn." Thomas's face lit up with an expression of pure joy, the first truly happy expression Clara had seen from him. He nodded enthusiastically, then did something that surprised them both. He reached out and gently touched his father's hand. Lord Blackthorn went very still, staring down at the small hand resting on his own. For a moment his carefully controlled mask slipped entirely, revealing a depth of love and anguish that made Clara's throat tighten with emotion. "Yes," he said hoarsely, "someday." The moment was broken when Thomas suddenly stepped back, as if remembering some invisible barrier that existed between him and his father. Lord Blackthorn's expression closed off again, and the warmth disappeared from his voice. "You should return to your lessons," he said formally. "Miss Whitmore, please ensure Thomas doesn't overtire himself." "Of course, my lord." As they walked away, Clara glanced back to see Lord Blackthorn watching them go, his expression unreadable but his posture somehow conveying profound loneliness. "Can you imagine how heartbreaking it must be to love your child desperately, but believe yourself responsible for their pain?" Lord Blackthorn was trapped in a prison of his own making, and he couldn't see that Thomas needed his love more than his protection. But sometimes the walls we build to protect others become the very things that hurt them most. That evening, as Clara was preparing for bed, she heard soft footsteps in the corridor outside her room. Curious and slightly concerned, she opened her door to find Thomas standing in the hallway, wearing his nightgown and clutching a small stuffed horse. "Thomas, what are you doing awake, sweetheart?" The boy pointed down the corridor toward what Clara assumed was Lord Blackthorn's quarters, then made a gesture she'd come to recognize as indicating distress or fear. "Are you worried about your father?" Thomas nodded, then pointed again down the corridor. In the distance, Clara could hear a sound that made her stomach clench, the harsh, broken sounds of a man in the grip of a nightmare. "Oh, Thomas," she whispered, understanding flooding through her. "Does this happen often?" Another nod, and this time Thomas's eyes filled with tears. Clara found herself facing a dilemma. Clearly Lord Blackthorn was suffering from nightmares that were distressing his son, but approaching the lord of the manor in his private quarters would be highly improper, yet Thomas was obviously upset and in need of comfort. The decision was made for her when the sounds from down the corridor grew louder and more distressed. Whatever Lord Blackthorn was experiencing, it was severe enough that Clara feared he might hurt himself in his distress. "Stay here, Thomas," she whispered. "I'll see if I can help." Clara hurried down the corridor, her heart pounding with anxiety and her mind racing with the impropriety of what she was about to do. The sounds were coming from behind a door near the end of the hall, harsh breathing, incoherent words, and what sounded like furniture being knocked about. Clara knocked softly on the door. "Lord Blackthorne, are you all right?" The sound stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence that was somehow more ominous. "My lord," Clara tried again. "I heard. Thomas heard. Are you in distress? Go away." The voice was rough, barely recognizable as Lord Blackthorne's cultured tones. "I'm sorry, but I can't do that. Thomas is frightened." The door flew open with such force that Clara jumped backward. Lord Blackthorne stood in the doorway, and Clara's breath caught at the sight of him. His dark hair was dishevelled, his face was pale and drawn, and his shirt was torn at the shoulder. But it was his eyes that made Clara's heart ache. They held the wild, hunted look of a man being pursued by demons. "I said, go away," he repeated, though his voice lacked its earlier harshness. "Lord Blackthorne, you're bleeding," Clara said, noticing the scratches on his arms, where he'd apparently clawed at himself in his sleep. He looked down at his arms, as if seeing them for the first time, then laughed bitterly. "It's nothing. Return to your quarters, Miss Whitmore. This is not your concern. With respect, my lord, when it frightens Thomas, it becomes my concern." At the mention of his son, Lord Blackthorne's expression changed. Thomas heard. Clara nodded, glancing back toward where the boy still stood watching them with wide, worried eyes. Lord Blackthorne saw his son and went very still. "How long has he been standing there?" "Not long. He came to get me because he was worried about you." Something crumbled in Lord Blackthorne's expression. He took a step toward Thomas, then stopped as if invisible chains held him back. "Thomas," he said, his voice gentle despite his obvious distress, "you should be in bed." Thomas shook his head and took a tentative step toward his father, then another and another, until he was standing directly in front of Lord Blackthorne, looking up at him with eyes full of concern and love. Without hesitation, Thomas reached up and touched one of the scratches on his father's arm, his small face creased with worry. Lord Blackthorne stared down at his son, and Clara saw tears gathering in his dark eyes. "I'm all right," he whispered. "Just a bad dream. Nothing more." Thomas didn't look convinced. He tugged gently on his father's hand, then pointed toward Lord Blackthorne's room. "I think he wants to make sure you're truly all right," Clara interpreted softly. Lord Blackthorne hesitated, clearly torn between his desire to comfort his son and his apparent belief that he should maintain distance between them. "Perhaps," Clara ventured, "Thomas could sit with you for a few minutes, just until you're feeling more settled." The internal struggle playing out on Lord Blackthorne's face was painful to witness. Finally, he nodded. "For a few minutes," he agreed. "Then you must return to bed, Thomas. Promise me." Thomas nodded eagerly and followed his father into the room. Clara started to retreat, but Lord Blackthorne's voice stopped her. "Miss Whitmore, would you, that is, perhaps you could stay as well, for propriety's sake." Clara understood. A man alone with a child in the middle of the night, even his own son, could lead to gossip. Her presence would eliminate any questions about impropriety. Lord Blackthorne's room was masculine and elegant, dominated by a large four-poster bed and a fireplace that cast dancing shadows on the walls. What struck Clara most, however, was how impersonal it felt, as if the man who lived here had deliberately stripped away anything that might provide comfort. Thomas immediately went to his father's bedside and climbed onto the massive bed, settling himself against the pillows as if he belonged there. Lord Blackthorne followed more slowly, sitting on the edge of the bed as if he were the guest in his own room. "Better?" he asked Thomas softly. Thomas nodded, then patted the space beside him, clearly inviting his father to lie down. "I'm not certain I'll be able to sleep again tonight," Lord Blackthorne admitted. "The dreams, they're quite vivid." Thomas pointed to himself, then made a gesture. Clara had seen him use when he wanted to stay close to something or someone. "You want to stay with me?" Lord Blackthorne interpreted. An enthusiastic nod. Clara watched this exchange with a heart full of both joy and sadness. It was clear that Thomas adored his father and wanted nothing more than to comfort him. Just as it was clear that Lord Blackthorne's love for his son was absolute, yet some invisible barrier kept them from the natural closeness they both craved. "Perhaps," Clara said gently, "I could tell Thomas a story while you both rest." Sometimes a quiet voice can chase away the lingering shadows of bad dreams. Lord Blackthorne looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You would do that?" "Of course." Clara settled into a chair beside the bed and began weaving a gentle tale about a brave young prince and his wise father who ruled their kingdom with kindness. As she spoke, she watched both father and son gradually relax. Thomas curled up against his father's side, and after a moment of hesitation, Lord Blackthorne's arm came around the boy, holding him close. The sight of them, together, the powerful lord and his small son, made Clara's throat tighten with emotion. By the time she finished her story, Thomas had fallen asleep in his father's arms, and Lord Blackthorne's breathing had deepened into natural rest. Clara remained in her chair for a while longer, watching over them both, before finally slipping quietly from the room. "Now, if that moment didn't touch your heart, I don't know what will. Sometimes the most healing thing we can do is simply be present for someone in their darkest moments." Clara was beginning to understand that this family needed more than just a governess. They needed someone who could help them find their way back to each other. The next morning brought an awkwardness Clara had anticipated. She and Thomas were in the nursery working on their lessons when Lord Blackthorne appeared in the doorway, looking formal and distant once again. "Miss Whitmore, might I have a word with you?" "Privately?" Clara's stomach tightened with apprehension. She'd feared this moment, the conversation where Lord Blackthorne would dismiss her for overstepping her bounds the night before. "Of course, my lord. Thomas, please continue with your mathematics. I'll return shortly." They stepped into the corridor, and Lord Blackthorne closed the nursery door behind them. For a moment he stood in silence, clearly struggling with what he wanted to say. "About last night," he began finally. "I owe you an apology." This was not what Clara had expected. "My lord, you should not have been subjected to my difficulties. It was inappropriate and unfair to you. Lord Blackthorne, you were in distress. Anyone with a heart would have offered help." He studied her face as if looking for signs of deception or pity. "Nevertheless, I've made a decision. I think it would be best if Thomas takes his evening meals in the nursery from now on. And perhaps you could ensure he remains in his room after 8 o'clock. Clara's heart sank as she understood his meaning. Lord Blackthorne was trying to protect Thomas from witnessing his nightmares again, but in doing so, he was further isolating himself from his son. "My lord, might I suggest an alternative?" His jaw tightened. "What alternative?" "Thomas loves you very much. Last night his first instinct wasn't to hide from your distress, but to seek help for you. Keeping him away from you won't protect him. It will only make him worry more." "Miss Whitmore, please, hear me out," Clara pressed on, knowing she was risking her position but unable to remain silent. "What if, instead of avoiding the problem, we addressed it? You mentioned the nightmares are frequent. Have you considered that having Thomas nearby might actually help? Children have a remarkable ability to anchor us to the present when our minds try to drag us into the past." Lord Blackthorne's expression was unreadable. "You think I should subject my 8-year-old son to my episodes? I think your 8-year-old son wants to help his father, and I think denying him that opportunity might hurt him more than any nightmare could." They stared at each other in tense silence. Finally, Lord Blackthorn spoke. "You don't understand what you're asking. The dreams, they're not simple nightmares, Miss Whitmore. They're memories, terrible memories that no child should witness. Then, perhaps it's time to make new memories, better ones." For a moment, something vulnerable flickered in Lord Blackthorn's eyes. Then his expression closed off again. "I'll consider your suggestion," he said formally. "That will be all." As he walked away, Clara felt a mixture of frustration and determination. She was beginning to understand that Lord Blackthorn's greatest enemy wasn't whatever haunted his dreams, it was his own belief that he was beyond redemption. Have you ever known someone who was so convinced they were damaged that they pushed away everyone who tried to love them? Lord Blackthorn was trapped in that terrible cycle, but Clara was starting to see cracks in his armor. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is refuse to let someone we care about give up on themselves. The breakthrough came 3 weeks later, on a grey October afternoon when autumn rain lashed against the manor's windows. Clara and Thomas were in the library, a magnificent room lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes. Thomas had developed a particular fascination with a beautifully illustrated book of fairy tales, and Clara was reading to him when she noticed his attention had wandered. Following his gaze, she saw Lord Blackthorn standing in the doorway, hesitating as if unsure whether to enter. "Please, come in, my lord," Clara said warmly. "Thomas and I were just reading about the brave princess who rescued the dragon." A slight smile touched Lord Blackthorn's lips. "Rescued the dragon? That's a rather unusual twist on the traditional tale. Thomas seems to prefer stories where the misunderstood creature finds kindness rather than destruction," Clara explained. "Don't you, Thomas?" Thomas nodded enthusiastically, then surprised both adults by patting the space beside him on the large sofa, clearly inviting his father to join them. Lord Blackthorn hesitated, then slowly approached and settled beside his son. Thomas immediately leaned against his father's side, and Clara saw Lord Blackthorn's arms come around the boy instinctively. "Would you like me to continue the story?" Clara asked. "Please," Lord Blackthorn said quietly. As Clara read, she became aware of the subtle changes in both father and son. Thomas seemed more relaxed than she'd ever seen him, while Lord Blackthorn's usual tension gradually eased. When she reached a particularly exciting part of the story, Thomas grabbed his father's hand, his eyes wide with anticipation. It was such a natural, childlike gesture that Clara's heart ached with hope. "What do you think happens next, Thomas?" Clara asked, setting the book aside. Thomas looked thoughtful, then began an elaborate pantomime, clearly acting out his version of the story's conclusion. His gestures were so expressive and animated that both Clara and his father found themselves smiling. "I think," Lord Blackthorn said, watching his son's performance, "that the dragon and the princess become the very best of friends and have many adventures together." Thomas beamed at his father's interpretation and nodded vigorously. "That's a lovely ending," Clara agreed. "Much better than the traditional version where someone gets hurt." Something in her tone made Lord Blackthorn look at her sharply, and Clara realized her words might have struck closer to home than she'd intended. "Not all stories can have happy endings, Miss Whitmore," he said quietly. "Perhaps not," Clara replied carefully, "but sometimes we can choose to write a better second chapter." Their eyes met across Thomas's head, and Clara saw understanding pass between them. They weren't really talking about fairy tales anymore. Thomas, sensing the tension, looked between the two adults with concern. Then he did something that surprised them both. He took his father's hand and placed it over Clara's hand, then covered both with his own small hands. The gesture was so pure, so full of love and hope for connection, that both adults fell silent. "Thomas," Lord Blackthorn said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You want us all to be friends?" Thomas nodded, then pointed to his father, then to Clara, then to himself, making a circular gesture that clearly indicated he wanted them to be a family unit of sorts. Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the child's innocent wisdom. Here was a boy who had been through unimaginable trauma, yet his first instinct was still to love, to hope, to try to bring people together rather than push them apart. "I would like that very much," Clara said gently, looking at Thomas. "Would you like that too, my lord?" Lord Blackthorne stared down at their joined hands, his large, scarred one, Clara's slender, gentle one, and Thomas's small hand covering them both. When he looked up, his dark eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Yes," he whispered, "I would like that very much." Thomas's smile was radiant, and he clapped his hands together once in delight. Then, in a gesture that took both adults completely by surprise, he leaned forward and kissed his father's cheek, then turned and kissed Clara's cheek as well. "Oh, Thomas," Clara breathed, her heart overflowing with love for this remarkable child. Lord Blackthorne gathered his son into his arms, holding him close as if he were the most precious thing in the world, which Clara realized he was. For the first time since her arrival at Ravenshollow Manor, Clara felt genuine hope that this broken family might truly heal. If you're feeling emotional right now, you're not alone. There's something magical about seeing love break through walls of pain and fear, but the real test was still coming. Because healing isn't always a smooth path. Sometimes we have to face our deepest fears before we can truly move forward. That evening, Lord Blackthorne surprised Clara by asking if she would join him and Thomas for dinner in the smaller, more intimate family dining room rather than the formal dining hall. It was the first time she'd been invited to dine with them, and she sensed it represented a significant shift in their relationship. Thomas was delighted with the arrangement, chattering away in his silent language of gestures and expressions, while his father watched with a mixture of love and wonder. "He's quite eloquent without words," Clara observed, interpreting one of Thomas's more complex gestural stories for his father. "He always has been," Lord Blackthorne said softly. "Even before he stopped speaking, he had remarkable expressiveness. His mother used to say he could tell entire stories with just his eyes." The moment the words left his mouth, Lord Blackthorne tensed, clearly regretting the reference to Thomas's mother. But Thomas didn't withdraw this time. Instead, he looked at his father with curiosity, as if waiting for more. "Would you like to hear about your mother?" Lord Blackthorne asked carefully. Thomas nodded, though Clara noticed his hands tighten slightly on his napkin. Lord Blackthorne was quiet for a long moment, clearly choosing his words carefully. "She was beautiful, the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. She had hair the color of spun gold and eyes like sapphires, but more than that, she was kind. She could make anyone smile, no matter how sad they were feeling." Thomas's eyes were fixed on his father's face, drinking in every word. "She loved you more than life itself," Lord Blackthorne continued, his voice growing softer. "From the moment you were born, you were the center of her world. She used to sing to you every night before bed. Do you remember?" Thomas nodded slowly, and Clara saw tears gathering in the boy's eyes, but they didn't seem to be tears of distress. They seemed to be tears of recognition, of precious memories being acknowledged. "She taught you to read, didn't she? She would sit with you for hours, going over the same books again and again because you loved hearing the stories." Another nod, and this time Thomas smiled. A real, genuine smile full of love and remembrance. "What happened to her?" Clara asked gently, sensing that this moment of openness might be their only chance to understand the tragedy that had shaped this family. Lord Blackthorne's face went pale, but he didn't retreat as Clara had expected. Instead, he looked at Thomas, as if seeking permission to continue. Thomas reached out and took his father's hand, squeezing it encouragingly. "There was a fire," Lord Blackthorn said quietly, "in the east wing of the manor, Elizabeth. Thomas's mother was trapped. I tried to reach her, but—" he touched the scar on his face unconsciously. "I couldn't save her." Clara's heart ached at the pain in his voice, but she pressed gently for more. "What about Thomas?" "Thomas was with her in the nursery, which was in the east wing at that time. When I realized what was happening, I ran toward the fire, but the smoke was so thick, the flames so intense." Lord Blackthorn's voice broke. "I found Thomas collapsed in the corridor outside the nursery. He'd been trying to get back to his mother." Clara looked at Thomas with new understanding. The boy had witnessed his mother's death and had been unable to save her. No wonder he'd retreated into silence. "Elizabeth died calling for Thomas," Lord Blackthorn continued, tears now flowing freely down his cheeks. "Her last words were his name, and I failed them both." Thomas suddenly stood and went to his father, climbing onto his lap, despite being almost too big for such gestures. He wrapped his small arms around Lord Blackthorn's neck and held on tight, offering the comfort of his physical presence. "Oh, my darling boy," Lord Blackthorn whispered, holding his son close. "I'm so sorry, so very sorry." Thomas pulled back and looked into his father's eyes. With great deliberation, he reached up and touched the scar on his father's face, not with pity or fear, but with love and acceptance. Then he pointed to himself, then to his father, then made a gesture Clara had come to recognize as meaning together or family. "Yes," Lord Blackthorn said, understanding his son's message. "We're together, we're family, and we're going to take care of each other." Clara wiped tears from her own eyes, overwhelmed by the beauty of this moment of healing between father and son. But Thomas wasn't finished. He looked at Clara, then back at his father, then made the same family gesture, this time including her in the circle. "Thomas," Clara said gently, "I'm not actually family. I'm just your governess." Thomas shook his head firmly, then pointed to his heart, then to Clara, then to his father. His meaning was clear. In his heart, she was family. Lord Blackthorn looked at Clara with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Thomas has excellent judgment," he said quietly. "If he considers you family, then perhaps that's what you are." The warmth in his voice, the acceptance in his eyes, made Clara's heart race with possibilities she hadn't dared imagine. Now, if you're wondering whether a governess could truly become part of an aristocratic family, remember that love doesn't follow the rules of society. Sometimes the heart knows what it wants, long before the mind catches up. But their story was about to face its greatest test yet. Over the following weeks, the atmosphere at Ravenshollow Manor underwent a remarkable transformation. With the truth about Elizabeth's death finally spoken aloud, both Lord Blackthorn and Thomas seemed freed from a terrible burden. Thomas began showing more animation than Clara had ever seen from him. While he still didn't speak, his silent communication became more elaborate and expressive. He seemed to take particular joy in orchestrating interactions between Clara and his father, often maneuvering them into situations where they would be alone together. Lord Blackthorn, for his part, began joining their afternoon walks and occasionally their lessons. Clara discovered that beneath his stern exterior lay a man of remarkable intelligence and surprising humor. When he forgot to maintain his emotional barriers, he was charming, witty, and deeply caring. But it was the small moments that truly captured Clara's heart. The way he listened intently when she spoke about Thomas's progress, the way he unconsciously smiled when Thomas accomplished something new, the way his eyes softened when he looked at either of them. Clara was falling in love, and she suspected Lord Blackthorne might be feeling something similar, though he was far too much a gentleman to act on such feelings with someone in his employ. The crisis came on a cold November evening, when Clara was awakened by Thomas shaking her shoulder frantically. The boy was in his nightclothes, his face pale with terror, and he was making urgent gestures toward the door. "What is it, Thomas? What's wrong?" Thomas grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the door, clearly wanting her to follow him immediately. Clara threw on her robe and allowed herself to be led through the corridors toward Lord Blackthorne's quarters. As they approached, Clara could hear the sounds she'd come to associate with Lord Blackthorne's nightmares, but tonight they were worse than ever. Harsh cries of anguish echoed through the hall, punctuated by sounds of furniture being overturned. Thomas was trembling beside her, clearly distressed by his father's suffering, but determined to help somehow. Clara knocked on the door, but there was no response, only continued sounds of distress from within. "Lord Blackthorne," she called out. "It's Clara. Please, let me help." Still no response. Clara tried the door handle and found it unlocked. After a moment's hesitation, she pushed the door open. The room was in chaos. Furniture had been overturned, books scattered across the floor, and in the center of it all, Lord Blackthorne knelt on the floor, his hands pressed to his ears, as if trying to block out sounds only he could hear. "Elizabeth," he cried out in anguish, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Clara's heart broke at the raw pain in his voice. This wasn't just a nightmare. This was a complete break from reality, as if he were reliving that terrible night over and over again. "Thomas, stay by the door," Clara instructed, then slowly approached Lord Blackthorne. "Adrian," she said softly, using his given name for the first time. "Adrian, you're safe. You're at Ravenshollow. The fire was years ago." He looked up at her with wild, unfocused eyes. "Clara, no, you have to get out. The fire, you'll be trapped." He grabbed her arms, his grip almost painful in its intensity. "Please, don't let the fire take you too." Clara realized that in his confused state, Lord Blackthorne was seeing her as Elizabeth, reliving the night of the fire with terrifying clarity. "I'm safe," she said calmly, covering his hands with hers. "We're both safe. There's no fire." "I can smell the smoke," he insisted, his breathing becoming increasingly erratic. "I can hear her calling for help, and I can't reach her." Behind them, Clara heard a soft sound and turned to see Thomas approaching slowly, his face etched with worry for his father. "Thomas, no," Clara began, but the boy ignored her, moving to kneel beside his father. With infinite gentleness, Thomas reached out and touched Lord Blackthorne's face, just as he had that night, weeks ago. "Thomas?" Lord Blackthorne's voice was confused, as if he couldn't understand how his son could be there when he was supposed to be in danger. Thomas nodded, then very carefully took his father's hands and placed them on his own face, as if to prove he was real and present. "You're here," Lord Blackthorne whispered, his breathing beginning to slow. "You're safe." Thomas nodded again, then did something extraordinary. He opened his mouth, and for the first time in 3 years he spoke. "Papa," he said, his voice rusty from disuse, but clear and strong. "Papa, I'm here. I'm safe." Lord Blackthorne went completely still, staring at his son in shock. "Thomas? Did you—" "I'm here, Papa," Thomas repeated, his small voice full of love and determination. "The fire is gone. Mama is gone. But I'm here, and Clara is here, and you're here. We're safe." Tears poured down Lord Blackthorne's cheeks as he gathered his son into his arms. "Thomas, oh, my precious boy, you spoke. You spoke to save me from the darkness." Thomas held his father tight, and Clara saw that the boy was crying too, but they were tears of relief and love, not pain. "I love you, Papa," Thomas whispered. "I love you and I love Clara. We're a family now." Clara felt her own tears flowing as she watched this miraculous moment of healing. Thomas had found his voice not for himself, but to save his father from the prison of his own guilt and grief. Lord Blackthorne looked up at Clara over Thomas's head, his dark eyes shining with tears and something that looked very much like love. "Clara," he said softly, "how can I ever thank you? You've given me back my son." "You both gave yourselves back to each other," Clara replied. I just helped you remember that love is stronger than pain." Thomas pulled back from his father's embrace and looked between the two adults with the wisdom that only children possess. "Papa," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word, "do you love Clara?" Lord Blackthorne's eyes widened at his son's direct question, but after a moment he nodded. "Yes, Thomas, I do love Clara, very much." "Clara," Thomas turned to her with a solemn expression. "Do you love Papa?" Clara felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she couldn't lie to this brave, wonderful child who had just found his voice. "Yes, Thomas, I love your father very much." Thomas clapped his hands together with delight. "Then we can be a real family. Papa, will you marry Clara?" Now, if you think that's an unconventional proposal, you're absolutely right. But sometimes love doesn't follow conventional rules. Sometimes it takes the pure heart of a child to show adults what they really want. Lord Blackthorne looked at Clara with an expression of hope and vulnerability that took her breath away. "Thomas makes an excellent point," he said softly. "Clara, I know this is highly irregular, and I know our circumstances are unusual. But these past months, you've brought light into our darkness. You've helped me remember how to be a father, and you've loved my son as if he were your own." He stood slowly, never taking his eyes from her face. "I love you," he said simply, "not just as Thomas's governess, but as the woman who saved us both. Will you marry me? Will you truly become part of our family?" Clara looked at this man who had seemed so cold and unreachable when she'd first arrived, and saw him as he truly was, a devoted father who had been lost in his own pain, a man capable of deep love who had simply forgotten how to show it. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, with more certainty, "Yes, Adrian, I will marry you." Thomas let out a whoop of joy and threw himself at both of them, wrapping his arms around their waists and holding them close. "We're going to be so happy," he announced with the confidence of a child who had just seen his deepest wish come true. Mama would be happy too. She wanted Papa to smile again. Lord Blackthorne knelt down to Thomas's level, cupping his son's face in his hands. "How do you know that, sweetheart?" "Because she told me," Thomas said simply. "In my dreams. She said she was waiting for someone special to come and make us a family again. She said Clara was that someone special." Clara felt fresh tears spring to her eyes. Whether Thomas had truly dreamed of his mother or simply needed to believe she would approve, his words filled her heart with joy. "Then we'll make sure to be the family she would want us to be," Clara promised, taking both their hands in hers. Lord Blackthorne stood and pulled Clara into his arms, holding her close as Thomas hugged them both. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. "I love you both more than life itself." And if you're wondering whether they truly lived happily ever after, well, that's the beautiful thing about love that conquers trauma and pain. When people choose to heal together, when they refuse to let the past define them, they can write their own happy ending. The wedding took place 6 months later, in the small chapel on the Ravens Hollow estate. It was a quiet ceremony, attended only by the household staff and a few close friends, but it was perfect in its simplicity and sincerity. Clara wore a gown of ivory silk that had belonged to Adrian's grandmother, altered to fit her perfectly. Thomas served as ring-bearer, his chest puffed with pride as he carried out his important duty. When the vicar asked if anyone objected to the union, Thomas actually stood up and announced, "I think it's perfect," which made everyone in the chapel laugh with delight. Adrian's transformation over those months had been remarkable. The haunted, withdrawn man Clara had first met had been replaced by someone who smiled easily, laughed often, and showed his love openly. The nightmares hadn't disappeared entirely, but they were less frequent and less severe, and when they did occur, Clara and Thomas were there to anchor him back to the present. Thomas had blossomed as well. Once he'd broken the silence that had held him captive for 3 years, he'd become quite the chatterbox, making up for lost time with an endless stream of questions, stories, and observations. His intelligence, always evident, now had voice to match it, and he threw himself into his studies with enthusiasm. But more than that, he had become the bridge between his father and his new stepmother, delighting in orchestrating family activities and ensuring that both adults knew how much he loved them. On their wedding night, as Clara and Adrian stood on the balcony of their bedroom overlooking the moonlit grounds of Ravens Hollow, Thomas knocked on their door. "Come in, sweetheart," Clara called, not wanting to send him away on such an important night. Thomas padded in, wearing his nightgown, carrying his stuffed horse, and looking unusually solemn. "What is it, Thomas?" Adrian asked, lifting his son onto his lap as they sat on the balcony chairs. "I just wanted to say thank you," Thomas said quietly, "for making us a real family, and I wanted to tell you something important." "What's that?" Clara asked, smoothing his dark hair. "Today, when you were saying your vows, I felt Mama," Thomas said simply. "Not sad Mama from my dreams, but happy Mama. She was here, and she was smiling. She said to tell you both that she's not sad anymore, because we're not sad anymore." Clara felt tears prick her eyes, and she saw that Adrian was struggling with emotion as well. "She said something else too," Thomas continued. "She said that love doesn't end when someone dies. It just finds new ways to grow, and our love for her helped us love each other." Adrian gathered his son close, his voice thick when he spoke. "Your mother was a very wise woman, Thomas, and you're a very wise boy to remember her words." "Are you sad that she's not here?" Thomas asked with the directness of childhood. Adrian considered the question seriously. "I'm sad that she can't see how wonderful you're growing up to be, and that she can't meet Clara, who would have loved her very much. But I'm not sad the way I used to be, because I know she would want us to be happy." "She does want that," Thomas said with certainty. "She told me so." As the three of them sat together under the stars, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had come to Ravens Hollow as a simple governess, hired to teach a mute child to read. Instead, she had found a family trapped by grief and helped them discover that love was indeed stronger than pain. Thomas had spoken his first word to save his father from the darkness of guilt and regret. But in doing so, he had saved them all, showing two broken adults that healing was possible when it was built on love, trust, and the willingness to be vulnerable with each other. If this story has touched your heart, please let us know in the comments below. Share your thoughts about the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds, and don't forget to hit that like button if you believe in second chances and happily ever afters. 5 years later, Ravens Hollow Manor was a completely different place. Laughter echoed through halls that had once known only silence and sorrow. The East Wing had been rebuilt and renovated, transformed from a place of tragedy into bright, welcoming family quarters. Clara and Adrian had been blessed with 2 more children, a daughter named Elizabeth, after Thomas's mother, who had inherited her father's dark eyes and her mother's gentle nature, and a son named William, who was the image of Thomas, but with Clara's green eyes. Thomas, now 13, had grown into a remarkably mature and compassionate young man. He doted on his younger siblings and had become an integral part of running the estate, showing a natural aptitude for the responsibilities he would one day inherit. But perhaps most importantly, he had never forgotten the lesson he'd learned that terrible night when he'd found his voice to save his father, that love required courage, and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was refuse to let someone you cared about give up on themselves. On the 5th anniversary of Adrian and Clara's wedding, the family gathered in the renovated East Wing, in a room that had been converted into a beautiful family portrait gallery. Among the paintings of ancestors and formal family portraits was one that held the place of honor, a painting of Elizabeth Thomas's mother that had been commissioned from a miniature they'd found among her belongings. In the painting, Elizabeth was smiling, her golden hair catching sunlight, her sapphire eyes full of life and love. Below the portrait was a simple inscription, Elizabeth Blackthorne, beloved wife and mother, whose love continues to bless this family. "Do you think she would be proud of us?" Thomas asked as they stood before the portrait. Adrian wrapped his arm around his eldest son's shoulders. "I think she would be amazed by the man you're becoming, proud of the family we've built, and grateful that her love didn't die with her, but grew into something even more beautiful." Clara, holding baby William while little Elizabeth played at their feet, looked around at this family she had come to love so deeply. "I think she would be most proud that you didn't let grief win, that you chose love instead." Thomas nodded thoughtfully, then surprised them all by stepping forward and placing a small bouquet of wildflowers beneath his mother's portrait. "Thank you, Mama," he said softly. "Thank you for bringing Clara to us. Thank you for teaching me that love is the most important thing. And thank you for showing me that sometimes the people we love need us to be brave for them." As they stood together in that room full of light and love, Clara marveled at the journey that had brought them all to this moment. She had answered an advertisement for a governess position and found instead a calling, a family, and a love deeper than she had ever imagined possible. Thomas had been hired to be taught to read, but in the end, he had been the one to teach them all the most important lesson, that no matter how broken we might feel, no matter how impossible healing might seem, love always finds a way. And in the end, isn't that what we all hope for? That our love will be strong enough to save the people who matter most to us, and that their love will be strong enough to save us in return. Thank you for joining us on this journey of healing, hope, and the triumph of love over tragedy. If this story has inspired you, please share it with someone who might need to be reminded that happy endings are possible, even after the darkest of beginnings. Remember to like this video and subscribe for more tales of love conquering all. The boy who had been hired to be taught to read had instead taught them all how to live again. And in speaking his first word to save his father from the darkness, Thomas had saved them all, proving that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most powerful messages of love. In the gardens of Ravenshollow Manor, where Clara and Thomas had first walked together in awkward silence, now rang the laughter of children at play. Where shadows had once lingered, sunlight now danced through leaves. And where broken hearts had once hidden behind walls of grief, a family flourished in the warmth of love, freely given and gratefully received. For in the end, Clara Whitmore had not simply been hired to teach a mute child to read. She had been called to help write a new chapter in the story that seemed destined for tragedy. A chapter filled with hope, healing, and the kind of love that transforms everything it touches. And they all lived as the very best families do, not quite happily ever after, because life is never that simple, but lovingly ever after, which is infinitely more beautiful and real. This is the end of our story, but remember, every ending is just a new beginning waiting to unfold. Thank you for staying with us until the very end, and may your own story be filled with the kind of love that conquers all.